Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets. My not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophonous cavalcade of conversation. Thanks for spending some time with us on what is a blistering hot evening here in the desert, just what one would expect for late June in this neck of the cacti. Tonight, big questions, the kind of questions that stretch our brains, make us think, make us wonder about our place in the cosmos, in the universal pecking order, even in the food chain. In the second half of our program tonight, astrophysicist Adam Frank proposes this bold concept that we can learn a heck of a lot about human civilization, about the future of the Earth, the future of humanity, by studying alien worlds and presumably alien civilizations, if there are any. You're probably familiar with the Drake equation, which tries to figure out and guess how many intelligent civilizations might be out there. You probably also remember the Fermi paradox, which asks, okay, where is everybody? If they're out there, why aren't we seeing them? Adam Frank thinks that by exploring those kinds of questions, we're able to confront some truths about ourselves and the path we're on. His new book is called Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of Earth. Heady stuff. Fun to ponder those kind of macro-cosmological questions. But first, the return of Dr. Eric Davis. You might recall I asked this outspoken physicist to come on the program for an hour earlier this year, followed by his colleague, Dr. Hal Puthoff, to talk about the controversial study of UFOs and related phenomena that was carried out on behalf of the Pentagon. That news, as you know, broke out into the open 7 or so months ago when the New York Times cut loose with this controversial, massively huge front-page story. And then we saw 3 videos that were eventually made public by To the Stars Academy as well as by the New York Times, supposedly released by the Pentagon, including the now famous encounter between U.S. Navy pilots and something dubbed the Tic Tac UFO. So much has happened in the last few months regarding that story. So many new developments. New eyewitnesses have come forward to be interviewed, including Commander Dave Fravor, the leader of the Black Aces Squadron, connected to the USS Nimitz carrier group. Last week on this program, we heard from Senior Radar Operator Air Traffic Controller Kevin Day, who was on the USS Princeton when the encounters, plural, encounters, went down back in 2004. He told us there were multiple incidents, multiple UFOs, well-documented case, and that these objects were not birds or ice crystals or lens flares or any of a number of alternatives proposed by armchair Internet experts and debunkers. The comments, the harshest comments, seem to have come from UFO true believers, the UFO crowd, the UFO organizations, the people who follow these topics closely. They've been harshest of all, asking that, not only just asking tough questions, but essentially debunking all of the information that's come forward and attacking the people who have made public this information. Tonight, we will dig further into the Tic Tac case, but also get a larger sense of what the bigger study was after. What was learned? Was it on the up and up? And what the future may hold for this kind of an inquiry. Eric Davis, if you know anything about him, does not pull punches, and anyone who's tangled with him on social media knows this very well. He speaks his mind clearly, distinctly, especially when debating the merits of the Pentagon study, which he was part of. Whether the topic is worth pursuing, he'll answer that. So this should be an enlightening exchange. He joins me in just a couple of minutes. Our webmaster, Greg Bishop, and I have pulled together our usual assortment of items and oddities culled from the world's news media. We call it Knapp's News. You can find it on the Coast to Coast website. A couple of the items there tonight deal specifically with the Tic Tac incident. There's a new interview that's been done with Dave Fravor that gets into many of the details about the Nimitz encounter with the Tic Tacs plural. We've got a science piece about whether I guess there's been an accomplishment in the last couple of weeks that scientists can finally account for all normal matter in the universe. And I'm using air quotes around the term normal matter. There's been a big question of where is all this stuff? Is it all dark matter? It seems to be missing. Well, this apparently answers that. We have a piece about Coco, the world's famous sign language gorilla who died this past week. It's kind of a heart warmer there. And questions about whether there's a cover-up regarding Black Project aircraft in the UK as well as in the USA. Those stories and more in Knapp's News. You can find it on the Coast website. While you're there, check out how to become a Coast Insider. Costs pennies a day, gives you access to a vast archive of previous broadcasts. It's a really good deal. You can also see how to become a subscriber to George Norrie's TV program, Beyond Belief, which covers a lot of the same material as this program. With that, I think we can assume the position. Bring in the dog and cat. It's too hot outside for them. Put on a pot of Joe. Slip into those jammies, the silky ones. Plop down in that Barca lounger. Turn down the light and turn up the radio, because in a moment, we're about ready to rumble. Eric Davis joins us to talk about secret Pentagon studies of UFOs. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. As we've all learned over the past couple of months, the Pentagon, which has always dismissed the UFO topic, saying it is of no interest to national security, nothing to study, move along, folks, nothing to look at here, actually got involved in a confidential study. I don't know if we can call it secret. It certainly was secretive, but a study of UFOs. And there was a program called ATIP. There was another program called OSAP. They contracted with a private organization, BASS. Sorry for all the acronyms, but we'll clear it all up. And the BASS folks hired dozens of scientists, investigators, researchers to look into issues surrounding not only UFOs, but peripheral issues as well, including a place near and dear to my heart, a place called Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. One of the scientists who was directly involved in this program is Dr. Eric Davis, a PhD physicist, chief science officer of Earth Tech International and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin. Dr. Davis' research specializations include breakthrough propulsion physics for interstellar flight science, beamed energy propulsion, and a whole bunch of stuff that's way beyond, way over my head. Eric Davis, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Good to hear from you. Good to talk to you again tonight.
Eric, I don't want to paint you as a hothead, but you, as I mentioned in the introduction a couple of minutes ago, you have tangled with some people on social media when they have raised questions, actually when they've spouted out nonsense about the Pentagon study that you were involved with, saying things that go way beyond just mere skepticism. I wonder if you regret jumping into the fray with any of these folks, whether it's kind of a lost cause, since they don't seem to be interested in learning more. They just seem to be interested in muddying the waters.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like don't bother them. Their minds are already made up. So, they're muddying the waters because they won't take yes for an answer, like what John Alexander always has said over and over again. And for those of you who don't know, John Alexander is the one who recruited me to my job at the National Institute for Discovery Science and helped me get my job with Bob Bigelow at NIDS. And so I've worked with him for, over 20, well, I worked with him during the era of NIDS, and I've stayed as a friend and colleague of his after that. So I've known him for over 20 years now, and he's right. There's a segment of ufology that just won't take yes for an answer. The authoritative statement of the Pentagon, of the Department of Defense, is we've encountered unusual craft. We don't know where they're from. What we know is that they absolutely outperform anything that's man-made on this planet. And we're not saying that they're extraterrestrial. They are, anomalous aerospace vehicles, which is the politically correct term for the old-fashioned loaded word, UFO. And we're going to tell everybody about it. The decision was made to share that information with the public in order to get some help. Are there observers out there who have seen something? If you've got good ideas on what it is that may explain these things, contact us, tell us. We're just sharing the information, and that's a paradigm shift for the Pentagon, given their past behavior at the end of Project Blue Book and the Condon Committee report that the Air Force the Air Force contracted, and then the decades of nonsense that have come out after that led up to the Clinton era, where in the first or second, I think it was the first Clinton administration, when he issued the order that everybody in the federal bureaucracy must fess up information on the Roswell crash in 1947. And what do we get from the Air Force? We get the two laughable reports, one on the Mogul balloons and one on the crash test dummies that weren't invented until the early 50s. And, of course, the episode we're talking about here is an alleged UFO crash that took place in the summer of 1947. You've got a bunch of people out there in the social network. It's a wide variety of human psychology. There's narcissism, there's sociopathology, there's a borderline personality disorder, there's Russian trolls whose job is to divide and conquer the American culture and by creating and stirring up fake controversies, creating chaos among organizations and cultural institutions, government institutions, in order to pry us apart. Vladimir Putin's job is to show the world why democracy is awful and why his way is the better way. And so you've got a combination of everybody out there. You've got the carnival barkers, the snake oil salesmen, and you've got some rational people among all that. And so I get irate, and I see some very stupid speculations, people that are not in the know. They are not only ill-informed, they are uninformed. They don't have access, and it's unfortunate, but that's the way our military is set up. Military sets up a secret security system to protect military secrets. We don't want our enemy knowing what we've got or what our plans are, what our technologies are. And a UFO program like this came under that auspices of that, because it's involving military platforms and military personnel who use classified military technology, weapons and surveillance sensor systems, radar, weapons, and all kinds of things to form a sensor fusion of data that helps the military warfighter be able to track down the enemy and accurately target it and shoot the enemy down. And so, you got to keep this stuff secret. So it comes across in a military program that there's hundreds of these tic-tacs occurring on the East Coast of the United States, the West Coast of the United States, and in the Middle East. And they've been interfering with mostly naval operations as well as some Air Force operations. And so basically, they decided they wanted to release it to the public, and that's what Luis Elizondo talked about. And he and I know each other pretty well, and he knows my reputation in the intelligence community, and he knows I'm a straight and narrow guy. I'm straight and above board, and he also knows that I don't put up with bullshit. And you've got too many people out there in the UFO community who are very interested in UFOs, but for some reason their interest stops, as if there's a big firewall against being interested any further whenever it's the Pentagon that comes up and brings out this fantastic information about these tic-tac vehicles that have been interfering with military operations on both coasts of the United States and in the Middle East. And,
well, we'll get into the tic-tac in a moment. It's a sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, where if you actually work for the Pentagon in trying to get to the bottom of this mystery and studying it, that means you're tainted. You're suspect, in the eyes of
conspiracy. We're the conspiracy, and it's like, oh yeah, right. I find it hard to believe that every member of the Pentagon who are patriotic Americans who are serving the taxpayer, the voter, the American public to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States and the government of the United States, as well as the freedoms and liberties of this country, that they would all band together to put together or contrive some massive UFO conspiracy And all you hear on the social media that you know that I've been responding to is this nonsense about, oh, it's a secret weapons program. We're going to hide a secret weapons program by calling it a UFO program or UFO encounter, and there's a program that's created, and it's to divert everybody's attention away from the real secret, and that's the super secret UAV development. And well, yeah, the U.S. government had been known, not the Defense Department per se, but the intelligence agencies, and they've been known to utilize UFOs as a cover for a not a weapon platform, but possibly a surveillance platform. But that was a long time ago. It was overseas in a foreign country, mostly being deployed against a major American foreign adversary. And I didn't say that right. I think I should just say a major foreign adversary against America. So anyway, this type of thing was used as a concealment, cover deception, perception management operation in the way of certain types of aerial platforms that are dressed up with special lights and paint jobs to look like UFOs so they can move a surveillance platform in and out of foreign enemy territory to collect information and bring it back home for our intelligence analysts to look at. They've never been deployed inside the United States, and that was a long time ago. And plus, they were helicopters.
Well, back to...
it's like we've all come together, the Nimitz Carrier Task Force, the battle group has come together to form a major conspiracy to fool everybody into believing that there's these tic-tac UFOs, and when in fact it was a real secret UAV thing. And it's just beyond the pale possibility. In fact, the answer is that the UFO explanation is the most parsimonious, plausible explanation there, given the pilot reports and given the multiple sensor data fusion reports of all the radar systems that were deployed against those Tic Tacs.
You've got overt hostility from the UFO folks, from UFO organizations have been clamoring for the government to take this seriously. We want a study. We want congressional hearings. We want you to look at this.
Yes.
But when it happens, those of you who are involved are described as shadowy. You're men in black. You're part of the conspiracy. It's, as I said, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah. And I could just say that Congress has been paying attention to this, but that's as much as I'm allowed to say about it.
Well,
Congress
Eric,
has been paying attention to this. And,
the Pentagon has not helped anything since the New York Times story broke. You've had a variety of conflicting and inadequate responses from the Pentagon about the study. Oh, it stopped. They didn't find anything. I think the responses have been misleading. It's as if they didn't really want this information to come out.
That I don't know. There could be a possibility that that's the fact. But there's also something else I know about the U.S. government, which 99.9999% of all Americans don't know, because that proportion of Americans, of the American population, simply does not know how the U.S. government works. The Pentagon is a monolithic bureaucracy. It is humongous. And the left hand doesn't always know what the right hand is doing or saying. And also, there is also problems of communicating across and down the stovepipes in the compartmentalized programs. And sometimes when that communication doesn't happen in an effective, efficient way, there are people that are not informed. And they happen to be the people that are going to front, that are going to represent their, I don't know what the expression is I'm looking for. They are the people that are going to communicate on behalf of the Pentagon with regards to whatever, military programs and press releases that they want to give to the American public. So, the conflicting information is I think a combination of all the above. It's people that were reluctant to want to reveal anything or acknowledge it. Plus, there are the other people in other departments that are not informed completely or entirely, or probably even partially. They just didn't really know. And you're going to run into that. Somebody gets sick one day. They're the guys that are read in on the Tic Tac situation. They're read in, but Grandma had a car accident down in Manassas. I got to drive down there. She's in the hospital. She's in the ER. So all the family's going to be converging down there because, by God, we love Grandma. She's 85 years old. So, that guy's left. He's left for the day, probably for the week. And they're going to have an assistant come in who has not been briefed. And that assistant has not been briefed, is not going to know to say the right things. And
I'll tell you what, Eric, we'll break right there. When we come back, I want to jump into Bass, how the Bass was chosen to be the contractor for the program, how it worked, and then a little bit later we'll get into the Tic-Tac. We're talking with Dr. Eric Davis, who has strong opinions about some of the critics who have come out of the woodwork to bash and muddy the waters regarding a Pentagon study of UFOs. It was conducted by Bass, an organization that was based here in Las Vegas, sponsored by the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, trying to look at UFOs and related mysteries in a scientific manner. And it's got nothing but trouble ever since the news broke that it was underway. Eric Davis is one of the scientists who was involved in that study. The boss of Bass is a guy named Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas billionaire and space entrepreneur. And it seems like whenever you hear the name Robert Bigelow in UFO circles, the word shadowy is attached, as if it's like his first name or something. The shadowy Bob Bigelow, which is hilarious. If you live here in Las Vegas, I mean, Bob Bigelow's not shadowy. He's well known. What's shadowy about him is he doesn't like to have his face on television. Until 2007, I don't think he'd ever done a TV interview at all because he likes to be able to go out and have a hamburger or drive himself around without people bothering him or threatening to kidnap his kids or grandkids, stuff like that. So until then, he never did any interviews, and that made him shadowy, I guess, in the eyes of a lot of folks. But there's nothing shadowy about him, and what he's done is spent more money of his own money out of his own pocket on UFO research than any person in history. Eric Davis is one of the scientists who worked for him. In a moment, we're going to ask what he did and how Bass conducted its business. We'll be right back. Eric Davis, I know there are some sensitivities about how far you can go in describing the Bass study, DIA, ATIP, all that stuff. A couple of weeks ago, though, your colleague, Dr. Hal Puthoff, for his first public presentation, sort of laid out in broad strokes how the study went down, what it was trying to accomplish. Can you do some of the same for the benefit of our listeners who did not hear that? How DIA instituted this thing, how Bass was studied, and what you did?
DIA put out a BAA, a broad area announcement for competitive bid to address the requirements that were laid out or outlined in the BAA. And there were some number of companies that bid for the contract, and Bigelow Aerospace won. And they stood up the Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, BAASS. And the DIA's job was to implement the operational component of the Advanced Aerospace Weapon Systems Application Program, whose nickname is the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. So ATIP, AATIP, was the actual program nickname. Program nickname is unclassified, but the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program is not a classified name, even though the program is classified to the extent that it was. So basically, the program was designed to, or set up to do UFO investigations, field investigations. So that was one segment of it. Another segment was to try to look into all of the disciplines of areas of physics, human interactions with computers. Oh gosh, I can't think of it all. Let's see. It's breakthrough propulsion and power, material sciences, human interactions, and stuff like that, stuff of that nature. And to look at these various disciplines and write expert white papers on 38 different topics that were identified as members of categories, these different categories, and there were several categories that I just listed. And the point was to have an expert, a world-renowned expert, write a paper to explain the current state of the art of a specific topic within a category. And let me give you an example: smart materials. Another one would be metamaterials, and another one would be anti-gravity, which is the one I did. And another one would be warp drives and wormholes and the negative vacuum energy that's required to produce them, and that's another one I did. Another one would be laser propulsion. That's another one I did. And then we had ones on the medical aspect, which I'm not going to get into because that's not my area. I had an expert on smart materials, and I already had the experts that handled the metamaterials. And, it just goes on and on. Oh, we had nuclear fusion, advanced nuclear fusion for aerospace propulsion and power. And so Hal recruited a couple of our colleagues at Lockheed Martin to do that paper. And we had one on another alternative nuclear fusion technique. And so what we were looking at was, what's the state of the art of these advanced physics and engineering and medical topics, and then extrapolate them to the year 2050 to use the laws of physics, the theories of physics and engineering and whatnot, and what we know, and then extrapolate it forward up to the year 2050 to see if we can possibly imagine that our science and engineering can reach a point to where we are able to at least reach the threshold of the performance of the Tic Tac vehicles or UFOs in general. Can we do it? Do we have the smart mirror in the year 2050? Can we imagine that the extrapolation of today's smart materials technology can do that, can reach the type of advanced materials that UFOs are made out of? Can we imagine a propulsion and power system that could reach the threshold of UFO technology? Can we imagine human machine or human computer interfaces in advanced cockpits or controlling maybe telepathy, where the astronaut or the pilot has to use telepathy in order to control the spacecraft? And so can we imagine that based on what we know using brain computer interfaces that are being experimented on for the Department of Defense now through DARPA and National Science Foundation research projects? So that was the point of what a chunk of what Hal and I were doing. So we had 38 papers that were published, and they were posted on the JWICF Classified Information Network is all I'm going to say about it. And they're made available for downloading and for study for those who have classified access. Now, the papers themselves were stamped for official use only, unclassified, which is a contradiction because for official use only is the lowest ladder on the classification. I'm sorry, the lowest rung of the classification ladder, with confidential above that, secret above that, top secret above that. So it makes no sense that they stamp the reports unclassified, comma, FOUO, and it's like, what? It's either unclassified or it's FOUO. Anyway, 2 of those reports were classified, so they're not going to get released. In general, these reports won't get released to the public. I know 2 of them or 3 of them, at least 2 of mine and one of Hal's, maybe one of mine and one of Hal's, got leaked by somebody in the Beltway, and now it's public and it's posted somewhere on the internet. And, that's okay. I also did another paper on with a colleague of mine. I was the second author on a paper. We were looking at warp drives using the vacuum energy that can be derived from extra space dimensions. So that's another one. We're trying to imagine how UFOs propel themselves through space. How are they propelled? We don't have physics. Yeah, go ahead.
This is way beyond the question of, are UFOs real? I mean, you are investigating, at some point, somebody was investigating individual cases to figure out whether they're legit or some kind of mistake. But it's beyond the question of, are they real? It's how do they work and can we make them?
Yes, that's right. That was one part of this whole thing, because this is a threat. That's what the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program nickname refers to. We have considered this to be a threat because the threat is when you're messing with U.S. military operations and deployments, either at the in CONUS or the continental United States or overseas, you're basically a threat. You're a safety hazard, or you could be an adversary. And so it was declared to be a threat, and a task force was organized in order to study the threat, gather data, analyze it, etc. So to heck with Condon's executive summary on his report, because he contradicted the contents of his own report that was put together by his own staff. And he said, there's no national security interest here of UFOs, and there's no scientific interest, so let's drop the whole matter. The fact is the Air Force specifically tasked him to come to that conclusion, regardless of the outcome of the main body of the report. So now that's been tossed aside. Pentagon's now said the Tic Tacs are a threat. Our pilots are encountering them. It's really messing with the deployments, and we can't do anything about it. So we got to figure out how we can do something about it. So the after action was, how do we do something about them? Let's get the best minds on the problem and study all the aspects of what it means to fly through the air and fly through space if possible, and imagine what sort of technologies and weaponry. And yes, we did have papers on weaponry as well, and a lot about one or two of my Air Force research lab reports from the previous decade addressed exotic advanced weaponry using today's physics, and how I can extrapolate today's physics to what would look like in 2050. I did a 2050 paper for the AFRL at Edwards Air Force Base at the end of my long contract tenure there. So anyway, so we have an investigative team that goes out. They're doing field investigations on UFOs, and they're gathering data, and et cetera. And that was not part of my job.
Did you get to answer any of the really big questions, Eric? What are these things? Where they're from? Or were those questions beyond the scope of what the Bass study did?
No, they were within the scope, but we weren't able to go far enough to be able to answer those questions. We know what they are not, George. They are not made on Earth by humans. It is impossible, given the performance that the various weapon radar systems and ship radar systems and fighter pilot radar and FLIR has demonstrated. They are not made here, George, but we don't know where they come from. Hal has a favorite hypothesis. He calls it the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. They could be advanced technology, aerospace technology, that are produced by a group of evolved hominins that split off from the main human race, and they might be that fourth unidentified hominin that was discovered and announced in the news over the last couple of years. They are the fourth one after the Denisovans. So you have you have Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and you have the Denisovans, and there is genetic evidence of a fourth hominin. And so, maybe they split off and they became very advanced. They could be the basis or the foundation for the legend of Atlantis, for all we know. And they saw the human race arising. They didn't like our warlike nature. They probably went underground and shielded themselves with their advanced technologies to protect themselves from us. And they're the ones who have the Tic Tacs and other UFOs.
Of course, you're speculating here. I mean, we don't want to be. You don't want to be quoted as. Right.
That's right. That's a hypothesis. The other hypothesis is the standard UFO hypothesis, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and that's one that Jacques Vallée and I are, kind of like we're on the border. We're on the fence about that one. We can't disprove that hypothesis because you really can't test it. And if they're interdimensional, for example, you can't test that either. What you're going to need is you're going to need to capture one of these guys. You're going to need to talk to them and communicate with them and find out where they are from and what their motives are. And we were not able to answer that question because the funding for the program to go to phase 2 did not happen for a variety of reasons I'm not going to get into. And whereas internal DoD funding continued to keep the ATIP program going. And the difference is that when you get congressional appropriations of large enough amount, you can afford to hire outside contractors. But when you don't, and you're operating, when you can't get that appropriation, and you're operating on internal funding only, you're really limited. You really cannot afford to hire outside contractors. So you have, you just have your military personnel, your intelligence analysts, your investigators going out collecting data, looking it over, and maybe they'll pull some people, some personnel that they can grab a hold of within the DoD and ask them to do some analysis. But they're really limited because everybody's got a day job, and so you have to pull people off their existing jobs in order to task them to work on this.
Well, for example, Lou Elizondo. Lou Elizondo had been in charge of the ATIP program, but really he was studying cases as they came in. Something like the Tic Tac would land on his desk, and then he does the best he can to make some sense out of it, as opposed to what Bass did, which was cast a really wide net, bring in whatever level of expertise there was, and try to figure this stuff out.
That's right, and that is right. And not only that, we also reached out to the I'll use this word because the aerospace industry, being the space industry as well, has really branched out into the private entrepreneurial space companies like Bigelow Aerospace and SpaceX and Blue Origin, et cetera, Sierra Nevada. Okay, so I've got to be careful when I call them aerospace companies. I'm going to say legacy aerospace company. That refers to Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and so forth. So we reached out to one of the legacy aerospace corporations, which is also a defense contractor, to establish a joint program so that we can pull on their talent, their scientific and engineering talent, and pull it with ours here at EarthTech and BAF, and put our heads together and do some cool stuff that we could try to answer these top-level questions you've asked.
So if you had not been stopped when the funding was cut off, where might you be now? Just speculate for a moment.
Okay, say that. Can you repeat that, please?
If it had not been stopped, if the funding had not been cut off in 2011 or 2012, and the OSAP, the BASS part of it, hadn't been stopped, where might you be now? Where might you be in figuring this stuff out?
Oh, geez, that's a good question. I couldn't imagine where we might be now. That's a big what if, right? We would have made a lot of progress. I think probably we would have continued with the field investigations. There was materials analysis that we could initiate on civilian-acquired samples, like molten slag that have been observed by civilian close encounter witnesses who ran out. They encountered a UFO in a close encounter situation. They saw the UFO dump some molten slag on the ground, which is a very old phenomenon. It's not new. Jacques Vallée has documented this for decades. Many others have too. And, like angel hair, silicon slab, or metallic alloy slag, I should say. And so these things have been recovered, and they were actually recovered by Blue Book investigators. We would have had that. We would have done the materials analysis, and it would have informed our hypotheses forming or hypothesis generating to help us narrow down the possibilities for the propulsion and power system on these UFOs. And we would have been doing that. And then the crash retrieval program. It's still there, and we would have gotten into the crash retrieval program using the legal authorizations that would open the door to us, and we would have gotten access to it, and that would have exponentially increased our knowledge base and understanding. Since we don't have a Tic Tac in possession right now, we're not in possession of one, it would have greatly accelerated our ability to develop the knowledge that we would need to at least figure out propulsion and power, material science, and possibly what weaponry they may have, because we all know in Jacques' book, Confrontations, and in other UFO books that have been used rigorous field investigations and analysis, that people have been hit by beams. Oh, there's the Colares event down in Brazil back in the...
We'll get into that. We'll get into that in a moment. Because the database that was put together for this study is, from what's described to me, gigantic, and includes databases as collected by other governments and other militaries. We're talking with Dr. Eric Davis about the Pentagon UFO study, study. We're talking about the Tic Tac UFO case. As you'll recall from the last hour of our conversation with Eric Davis, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, wanted to study UFOs. It put out a contract, and the contract was accepted by BASS, the organization based here in Las Vegas. They hired dozens of people, investigators, scientists, and studies various UFO cases, including what is now one of the most famous UFO cases of all time, the so-called Tic Tac encounter involving the USS Nimitz battle group or carrier group off the coast of Southern California in 2004. Since this news was first discussed here on Coast to Coast a couple of times last year and then broke even bigger in the New York Times story back in December, so much has been written about the Tic Tac case, and much of what's been written and said by critics has been utter nonsense. The Tic Tac was birds. It was ice crystals. It was a lens flare. The pilots were mistaken. The radars didn't work. On and on. Anything that sticks to the wall, anything other than what was actually reported. 2 days ago, Commander Dave Fravor, the Navy pilot who commanded the Black Aces squadron there with the USS Nimitz, the first pilot sent to engage the Tic Tac object, the credible and capable pilot Dave Fravor gave an interview to Jeremy Corbell and addressed some of the off-the-wall, nitpicky criticism that has arisen. Here's a clip from that exchange.
The people that say things like, you saw a bird, you have a mistaken identity, that was a conventional military drone, or it was just radar scatter. What do you say to people, or what would you say to people that have that opinion?
Well, everyone's going to have their opinion, but then again, I'd argue with anyone to come and discredit, what we saw or me or what was going on, and the fact that there's a lot of internet experts, I call them, and it is what it is. And that's fine. Everyone has that. I don't have time to answer or rebut everyone. But after 18 years of flying, I would argue the fact that if all you got to do is type on the computer and try and refute someone, then I'm not going to sit and argue with you. I'm not going to take the time. But I will tell you there's some extremely brilliant people in the world that are extremely interested in this incident and other incidents to try and do something about it instead of trying to debunk, poke holes, and say it isn't this, it isn't that, it's a spot on the array. I mean, everyone's an expert, but because you've seen a ship or you've seen an airplane or you watch Men in Black does not make you a UFO expert. I mean, I honestly saw one, and I don't consider myself an expert. And I think, really, if anyone's going to be one, I think it'd be the four of us that actually chased it.
In a moment, we'll ask Dr. Eric Davis what he knows about the Tic Tac case, especially since, as he said in the first hour, there have been hundreds of Tic Tac encounters. Hundreds. Back in a moment with more Coast to Coast AM. Eric Davis, I know in 2004, this encounter that we now know as the Tic Tac encounter occurred off the coast of San Diego, the USS Nimitz carrier group. Several witnesses, pilots, radar operators, some of whom we've had on this program. There seems to be a willingness, as we've discussed on social media, the internet, to dismiss this in some way, to diminish it, to confuse it, to muddy the waters. We saw the Skeptical Inquirer come forward with a ridiculous article this week. We've seen statements from people like Seth Shostak and Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, well, it's UFOs, it doesn't mean alien, which, duh. Can you address the Tic Tac incident? I know that from some material that I have seen that has not been made public that Bass did collect information and did take a look at this case. What's your take on it?
Well, that's right. They did. And the take on it is it's a legitimate UFO. It's, as I said in the previous hour, this is not a technology that is made on Earth by humans anywhere. It's let's put it this way. There is no observable control surfaces on the vehicle. There was no plume from a propulsion exhaust system. There were no, you know what I mean by control surface, like wings,
yes.
For example, wings, rudders, and so ailerons and so forth. So there's no propulsion plume, no rotors, and it outran the F-18. These things are very large. I mean, they were roughly almost 50 feet long and half that length in width, and they're shaped like an egg or like a Tic Tac, and that's remarkable. I mean, no control surfaces, no rotors, no plumes, no propulsion system, no internal air take, et cetera, or even external air take from an external propulsion system on a control wing, on a control surface wing. So that's what we came to the conclusion, is that these are legitimate, unidentified objects. They're anomalous aerial vehicles. They are under intelligent control, and they are an advanced technology. So those were two conclusions. And we don't know where they come from. That's three conclusions. And we don't know who's operating them, and that's four conclusions. And so they're generally anomalous. And that's what we concluded. And we've got to do something about them, because they are interfering with military deployments in the ocean, and they've interfered with Air Force deployments in the atmosphere. Wherever the Air Force is flying their planes, there have been UFOs. I have not been a part of that part of the investigation that talked to Air Force pilots, so I don't know that they have seen the Tic Tac. I know that there are pilots I'm aware of who've seen the triangles, they've seen the rectangular craft, they've seen spheres, and they've seen something egg-shaped, so maybe the egg shape is the closest to the Tic Tac shape that I've heard reported. They haven't used that name. It's the Navy pilots like Dave Fravor and the other guys who I won't name, who I know, have called it the Tic Tac, because that was probably the best description of the shape of the thing. I also know that a retired vice president of Lockheed Martin himself, he and his family, had a UFO encounter on the coast of California, and the craft they saw was a bit of a modified version of a Tic Tac, in that it came to almost a point on one end, and it had an unusual light pattern. And this guy had come up through Lockheed Martin, working for Ben Rich at Skunk Works, and he told me that he knows all of the advanced secretive aircraft and UAVs that are developed by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and all of the American allied nations, as well as non-allied nations that are not our adversaries. And he said he knows what, through intelligence information he gets briefed on, what the aircraft configurations and performances are, how they're lit up, et cetera, et cetera. And he said this thing that he and his family saw looked nothing like it. It absolutely behaved, and it flew in the sky like nothing he had ever seen before. And he came up through Skunk Works, working for Kelly Johnson. I'm sorry, Ben Rich. I'm sorry, it was Ben Rich. And so that's an example of a variety of shapes. And if you look at Frank Salisbury's book from the 1970s, I think it was, the Utah UFO display, where he had on the very front matter of the book a page showing all of the different configurations of UFOs that have been reported in the Uinta Valley in northeastern Utah. And pretty much if you go back to Bob Emenegger's book from 1974, that was the companion book to his show UFOs, It Has Begun, which was also known as UFOs Past, Present, and Future, that there's a couple pages of schematic artistic renderings of a variety of configurations of UFOs. So they come in different configurations. And it turns out the egg or the Tic Tac shape is one of them, and or cigar shape is another one. So anyway, that's what we concluded. Definitely not man-made, not consistent with human technology, not even consistent with black program technology that is usually anywhere from 10 to 30 years in advance of the white world technology. But there's a little secret about that. Black programs aren't always that way. For example, the stealth fighter program, which was done under the aegis of DARPA and the Air Force, that was called Have Blue, and it was run out and tested out at Area 51. When Lockheed Aircraft Corporation put their bid in for their prototype model aircraft to run in competition against Boeing and Northrop and so forth, they used an aircraft that was very unique. It's the one that ended up becoming the F-117 fighter bomber. But the prototype was based on a F-4 cockpit, canopy, and fly fly-by-wire control system, which was already invented in the 60s and was being deployed at the time in the 60s. So they used a version of it for the F-117, and they used analog aviation panel dials and indicators and switches on the cockpit, so inside the cockpit. So that was not by any means anywhere near 10 years in advance. They were using 1960s technology to put together a bid prototype for the contract, for the Half Blue contract. So it's very interesting when you read these histories of these things. So anyway, so this gentleman who retired as vice president of Lockheed Sunnyvale, up in Sunnyvale, California, basically said he saw a UFO and it was nothing that matched any configuration he was aware of, even in the black programs that he was briefed on, both domestic and foreign. So that's what it comes to. We are hearing the Pentagon absolutely admit that now we have some kind of craft that are deployed. They're interfering with aviator operations, naval aviators and Air Force aviators, and it is on both coasts of the United States as well as the Middle East, and it's a problem. And I have
in the Tic Tac case, Eric, in the Tic Tac case, we see the debunkers say, "Well, these pilots are poor observers. They'll throw anything at the wall to discredit it."
Yeah, that's a good joke actually, because the Black Aces that Fravor was the commander of, that's the VFA 41 group, and the VMFA 232 group was commanded by Doug Kurtz. He was a Marine Corps pilot, and they are known as the Red Devils. Well, these guys are your Top Gun elite naval aviators, and I swear to God, George, when SETI Institute astronomers and Neil deGrasse Tyson and some of the UFO community and other physicists and people sit there and say that military aviators are poor observers or they're not the best. Let's see. Tyson said they're the low form of evidence. They're the lowest form of evidence in science. Well, that's a joke because these guys fly planes at Mach 1 or higher speed, and they're engaging a foreign enemy aircraft from Russia, China, or wherever it may be, at the relative speed, which is the addition of the speed of our American pilots, military pilots' plane, and the speed of the enemy pilot's plane. Those speeds are added together, and that's the approach speed that they're coming after each other. So high Mach speed is what you're getting in here. They have to engage in high G maneuvers. They have to shoot weapons. They have to multitask when they are operating their cockpit to be able to deploy their weapons and their vehicle to overtake and overcome the enemy in order to shoot them down before they get shot down or before the aircraft carrier or any of the surface destroyers and other ships are bombed or attacked. And these guys cannot possibly have poor observational skills. And even an American general aviation pilot like myself with a private pilot license, single engine land, or even an instrument rating, you cannot have poor observational skills or be a poor observer because you are flying in aircraft traffic around airports and across the nation, and you've got to be multitasking in the cockpit. You've got to see the information being displayed in the cockpit as well as seeing what's outside your windshield to avoid a collision, avoid running into a mountain, whether it's day or night, and being able to navigate your way from one airport to the next. And military aviators have a more demanding set of situations on them physically, especially on their senses, their five senses, because they're having to land, for naval aviators, they have to land their craft on aircraft carriers. And aircraft carriers are on top of ocean water that rocks and rolls the ship. And Air Force aviators, it's not the same thing, but again, they're, high Mach speed, they're carrying weapons, high precision, they have instrumentation they've got to deal with and so forth.
Well, they're flying multi-million-dollar planes. They have highest security clearances. I mean, they're trusted in every other aspect of their job. So they're great observers.
Yeah, those planes are multi-tens of millions of dollars. And given stealth technology, the cost of stealth technology fighters, they're approaching in the $100 million range. These guys can't afford to make a single little stupid mistake that'll end up ditching that plane and possibly endangering their lives. They cannot be poor observers. And for the SETI Institute radio astronomers to say such stupid things, and a planetarium director to say such stupid things, and for some ufologists to say some stupid stuff, or amateur ufologists, I should say, and grumbling, complaining social media people, social network people, it's absurd. I mean, they're just basically shooting themselves in the foot because their arguments are not rational and don't take into account the facts of the situation. And they don't know what the facts of the situation are because they don't serve in the U.S. military. They're not aviators.
Let me ask you this, Eric. You mentioned about the Utah ranch. And I know that one aspect of the Bass study involved the ranch, following up on the work that had been done for NIDS. And you were on the ranch as part of the NIDS study and investigation. And one of the headlines that was written about the Pentagon, the DIA study, tried to discredit it by saying that you guys are chasing poltergeists. I think that was the Newsweek story. And although the study of the ranch involved unknown phenomena, you weren't there as a ghost hunt. You were there to try to figure out what was going on, right?
Correct. What you have to understand, and what did you say that was a Newsweek story?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What the writer of that story, who might have been quoting a subject matter expert, does not understand is that UFOs are not a simple, cut and dry subject matter. Basically, Jacques Vallée and I had put our heads together at the end of my tenure at NIDS, and we got together and we reviewed the NIDS database, which took into account all of our investigations at the ranch and all of our investigations that we did off the ranch. And what we realized is we did a pattern analysis on the data, and we also sprung for it off the original data analysis that Jacques began back in the 70s. And we updated it quite a bit for the 2000s. So we got invited to give a paper at the 2003 International Forum on Science, Religion, and Consciousness at the Fernando Pessoa University in Porto, Portugal in October 2003. So the paper we gave was a 6-level model for unidentified aerospace phenomena. And what does that mean? What that means is that UFOs aren't just a craft coming from wherever and interfering with human society and individual people or groups of people or whatnot. UFOs have 6-dimensional characteristics that forms the whole of the phenomenon. You cannot just say, for example, we identified level 1 or dimension number 1, or characteristic number 1 is physical. Physical meaning it's a technology. It's absolutely an advanced technology. It leaves traces. It leaves molten slag or angel hair and substances. Lonnie Zamora has seen depressions that the landed craft made into the ground, as well as the material left behind. So they're physical. Level 2 is anti-physical. Anti-physical is the case of UFOs where they have been seen to go through mountains. And Hal has his simpler version of general relativity theory where he can explain that. There's also the topological inversion effect, where you see a UFO, it looks like it's 40 feet across. It looks like it's 10 feet across, but when you go inside, if an abductee that remembers everything is able to remember what transpired, they go inside, and all of a sudden it looks like it's 100 feet across on the inside. So for some reason, the spatial extent on the inside of the craft is 2 or 3 or 4 times larger than the spatial physical extent of the craft on the outside, as observed by the witnesses. So that's anti-physical. Oh, and then there's the psychosociological. So that's level 3, and that's the obvious impact on the psychological and sociological state of individual humans and culture. And then there's the physiological effect, which Jacques identified in his book Confrontation, where beams are emitted by UFO, like in Polaris and elsewhere.
I'll tell you what, Eric, we're going to have to take a break there. That's some good stuff. When we come back, we'll open up the phone lines, maybe get a couple of your calls and questions from my guest, Dr. Eric Davis. We're rocking and rolling ourselves with my guest, Dr. Eric Davis, talking about the DIA's then secret study of UFOs and related phenomena carried out by BASS, an organization based here in Las Vegas. We've been hearing about the Tic Tac investigation and things that go much further than looking at unknown objects in the sky. In a moment, we'll take a couple of your calls and questions and comments and then ask Dr. Davis where this kind of research is heading next. We'll be right back. Eric Davis, before we go to the phones, I wanted to ask you about To the Stars Academy. Are you part of that? I know Dr. Hal Putoff is on the board, but I didn't know if you were part of it. And I'm asking it in this context is people in the criticism community, and it seems to be a lot of them out there, who will just lump everything together. Well, NIDS and BASS are the same, and since TTSA has some of the same people, they're all in the same boat, and it's all part of the same disinformation plot, Men in Black, cabal, blah, blah, blah. Are you part of it?
I am a part of it, but I'm not an officer. I'm an informal advisor, and I have a part of it that will become apparent when programs become implemented, and it'll be more of technological studies and activities that they want to get funded for laboratory studies. And so I'm not. So as I said, I'm not a part of the organization in the sense that I had any role in organizing it, standing it up. I don't go to meetings, but I know all the individuals. I've met with them individually. I've broken bread with Tom DeLonge a couple of times, and so forth. And when Hal is doing interactions with them, I'm usually doing interactions with them as well, not as many times as he has. So I know what's going on, and of course, TTSA has nothing to do with BASS. It has nothing to do with NIDS. This is Tom DeLonge's. It's like Tom DeLonge is just a younger version of Bob Bigelow. He has a fascination with UFOs and with life out there in space, and he wants to bridge those two ideas together. And so he's developed a very strong interest in UFOs and life in space and extraterrestrials and whatnot. And so I'm going to be involved in the essence that there's going to be programs of scientific studies that they're going to be initiating when they raise the funding for it, and I will play some kind of a role in that. And but otherwise, I'm just an informal technical advisor, counselor, and so forth. I wanted to return to that question I never really answered in a good way for you. Level 5 of that 6 levels of UFO phenomenon is psychic, and that is where the poltergeist phenomenon comes in with every UFO encounter. Level 6 is cultural impacts of UFOs, but the psychic component is the one that disturbs ufologists, many of them, not all of them, and it also disturbs your typical academic STEM scientist, because it's they consider psychic phenomenon to be fringe, and so it's a fringe topic, and they won't consider any reality to it or consider evidence that's been investigated on it or that's been collected on it. So poltergeist phenomenon is always attached to UFO encounters. It is something that's not very well understood or recognized by many in ufology, and even the really good scientific UFO groups that have existed since the 70s and 80s even ignored it. They just threw it out of any of their field investigations and case studies because it did not fit the model of what they believed UFOs or what they hypothesized UFOs to be, and that is extraterrestrials from another planet. And unfortunately, that's not the truth. The truth is every time you have UFOs, you're going to have poltergeist associated with them. And I personally experienced it when I came home. Every time I came home from my field trips to the Utah ranch, and I brought that poltergeist phenomenon home. A couple of the DIA military uniformed officers who went to the ranch to get a feel for it and see it and investigate it also brought poltergeist phenomenon home with them. And so it is a part of the psychic or level 5 characteristic deeper dimension of the UFO phenomenon. And it's hard to understand why, but that's part of why we're trying to study it. What we're trying to find out why that is. It could be that, in fact, that telepathy may likely be a major component of the UFOnauts who control these advanced technological devices, these technological vehicles. And telepathy might entail altered states of consciousness, manipulations of reality, and things like that get really exotic. And this is why physicists and ufologists are scared. They run from it. So, unfortunately, it's the data that we collected at the ranch during the nearly 6 years I was there and the nearly 10 years that Colin Kelleher was there working for Bob Bigelow at NIDS. And then if you talk to John Schuessler, who's the former international director of MUFON, and you talk to Jacques Vallée, who's published many books on that, you will find out that poltergeist phenomenon or psychic phenomenon is a key characteristic of UFOs. You can't get away from it.
It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I mean, the Pentagon killed the study in part because they worried it would be on the front page of the New York Times, and it was, and in part because they thought they'd be embarrassed, and some of them thought it was demonic and weird and freaky, and so they killed it. But you think that study should be revived, right?
Yes. Yep. So we would like to have that revived, and we hope that in the future that there's funding coming forth from Congress to revive it so that we can bring the contractors like us back into the fold and start working on this stuff. This does, this issue with the poltergeist and psychic component, it really does scare people away, and it scares some of your toughest Marine Corps officers, your toughest naval and Army and Air Force officers, people who have seen combat, who have been in danger, who've been shot, who've been wounded, who've seen their close colleagues, their close fellow combatants shot and wounded. And something like that is scarier than that, scarier than combat. And unfortunately, it proves to be a barrier for decision makers wanted to move forward. But to keep studies like this going and to keep them funded and to keep the bureaucracy hands off the program so that we can function freely and be able to do what we need to do to be able to study and understand what's going on and collect data and et cetera. So that's just an unfortunate thing, but it addresses the larger phenomenon associated with UFOs that we have to recognize. John Alexander brought up the issue of precognitive sentient phenomenon as a umbrella description for the phenomenon, and it addresses exactly what I'm just talking about. And so that's actually a very correct thing. It's a precognitive sentient phenomenon. And whether it comes from another planet, who knows? It could be highly evolved species that just use telepathy and altered states of consciousness and manipulate reality. They know how to mess with the fabric of space-time. At the quantum vacuum level, the structure of vacuum fluctuations, and that's where space-time emerges from. And they could rearrange things, and that's to suit whatever purposes they have.
Let's take a call or two. First-time caller,
Okay.
Lou in Chicago. Hi, Lou. You're on with Dr. Eric Davis.
Hey, George. Hey, Dr. Davis. George, thank you so much for continuing to dig into this. And Dr. Davis, thank you for everything you're sharing with all of us.
You're welcome.
I have two quick questions. The first one, you had mentioned earlier in the show that there was a surveillance platform, I think, that the DoD had disguised as UFOs in a foreign country some years ago. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that was. And then the second question is, when George asked you where ATIP would be with its research if it had not been defunded, one of your comments was that you said the crash retrieval program is, quote-unquote, still there. Are you saying that the intelligence community has actually had a crash retrieval program? And if so, which division of the intelligence community or military was running that?
Okay. The intelligence community's operation to deploy a fake UFO took place back in the 60s, I think it was, using helicopters. And I don't want to bring up the nations because that'll cause problems. So the name of the so I won't name the nation, but that was the gist of it, and I won't name the agency because I can't do that. So that was the gist of it, basically to do a penetration to probably test their defenses and do some surveillance and information collection. And they would use a helicopter that was rigged with a series of lights and paint jobs and noise effects and just swoop in and swoop out. And that took place in the 60s, and they haven't repeated that ever since that time. The crash retrieval program, yes, it exists, but it has been defunded since 1989. It's pretty much moribund in hibernation due to the fact that there was no success after several decades in being able to reverse engineer the technology. So it just went into hibernation. And I think it's probably going to be resurrected whenever our current physics and engineering and material sciences catches up to a level that we think that our decision makers think they would be confident in being able to reopen that can of worms again to investigate, to reverse engineer, do research on reverse engineering. So it's been pretty much in hibernation since about 1989.
Well, that makes it sound like there's something to analyze or to reverse engineer.
Yeah, they've got. I would say, if you're going to throw your bets on Roswell, your bet's really good. Del Rio, Texas, that was the 1950 case. That's another one. And the other ones I won't bring up because those are still classified. But and they have not been investigated to my knowledge. I'm sorry, they have not been revealed or published to my knowledge. So without knowing that that's the case, I won't talk about it any further. But we have crash retrievals, and they've been analyzed. And unfortunately, our laboratory diagnostic technologies and our material sciences and the understanding of physics that we had were not advanced enough to be able to make heads or tails of what it is, what they had their hands on. So it just the customer, being a certain government agency, decided to just pull the plug on funding, and so that was the end of it. And,
well, I think I know what tomorrow's headline is. That's east of the Rockies. Brian in Indianapolis. Brian, what's on your mind?
Hey, George. Good morning. How are you?
How's it going?
Good. Dr. Davis, great subject that you're talking about. And this video that these pilots recorded is just outstanding. And I don't understand the naysayers when we have videos from the space shuttle back in the day that NASA has shown where these unidentified objects are doing unusual things in space that that something that we can't do. But my two questions are real quick. I was checking into this online, and I come across a report of an F-18 pilot that was sent. I'm not sure. I can't remember where it was from. There was two of them that was sent to investigate a bogey on radar or whatever. But they said that when they got there, they were at a low-level altitude, 5,000 feet or so, if I remember correctly. And he said that they never spotted the object, but the water in the ocean was churned up like something had went into the water, but they never saw nothing above the water, at the water line, or below the water. And my second question, real quick, is also the radars for the aircraft couldn't lock on to the space, to the Tic Tacs. I read in the same report that they said that they would go like invisible. All of a sudden, they would just be invisible. Can you speak to that too, also, if you could, please? And good show again, George. I appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you. So let's see. The first question is that the pilot saw something that was just below the water surface. I don't remember the dimensions of it. It was very, very large, circular, and it was below the water surface, but they could see it from the air, and it was churning up the water beneath the Tic Tac. The Tic Tac was hovering over it, and that's as much as we got. That's as much data as we have on that. The second question was
about them being invisible.
Yeah, the weapons lock is a different radar system than what the surface ship defense weapons system, the weapons defense system and the surface ship navigation radars. They're a completely different type of radar. So this is consistent with past or historical UFO encounters by military aircraft, and that in that they tend to fade in and fade out so that you cannot get a solid weapons lock. They seem to go invisible, and I believe that Dave Fravor indicated that visually they went invisible, but I can't remember that detail, whether it was invisible strictly on the they did not go invisible on the FLIR. They just went invisible on the weapon radar lock, so they could not get a lock. And they didn't have any weapons to shoot at it either. They were carrying a couple dummy missiles while they were doing their test flights out there over the waters. So I think there was also a mention, I'm pretty sure they were mentioning that visually they would see the Tic Tacs fade in and fade out. So that implies a metamaterial cloak that operates over the broad visible band of the electromagnetic spectrum. So that's what comes to mind on that.
Try to get one more caller in on the wild card line. Dave in New Jersey. Hey, Dave.
They're here.
What's on your mind?
Yes, they are here.
Okay.
You are absolutely right.
Because calm down, doctor. No, I saw my first UFO at 17, living in Pennsylvania. Now, my question is, if you see one UFO, does that open you up to see more UFOs? Because I've seen a hell of a lot of them. Matter of fact, one night I was on my deck, and a small triangle craft was zooming by, had neon wingtips and neon nose, and it was so close to the building I could see its hull. It was a charcoal metallic gray color. Very cool, very close. Closest I've ever been to a UFO.
Dave, let's let Eric answer because we've got about a minute left. Eric, is there any kind of indication that once you've seen one, you'll see more?
Okay, can you repeat the question, please? It was hard to understand him.
He's asking if once you see one, does that make it more likely you'll see more, like that they end up following you around?
Well, it's possible. It's possible. Like I said, like the reports say, is that the Nimitz Carrier Task Force had actually encountered the Tic Tacs for a week, for about a 5-day period. So they saw more. So it wasn't just one. Well, we can't be sure that it was the same one. It could have been different ones. We don't know. But they did see hundreds of them operating off the East Coast, same number off the West Coast, and then an unknown number that I've not seen published yet in the Middle East. And at NIDS, we discovered a very interesting pattern in that if you took a wall map of the United States and put it up on the wall, threw dart at it randomly, wherever that dart lands, you send investigators out, you'll find that a number of people saw UFOs and the poltergeist, the accompanying associated poltergeist phenomenon. So usually there are people that if they see one, they've seen more, but not always. I had my own personal UFO encounter with my wife in broad daylight in Tucson, Arizona, when I was at a party for my upcoming PhD graduation at the University of Arizona, and there was a UFO. It was a boomerang-shaped UFO with big bright neon lights on it, and I never saw anything like that again. But then I go to the ranch. This was 1989, and then I go to the ranch in 96, and it wasn't until 97, 98 or so, 98 I think it was, when I saw the dark shadow event. But in late 96 and in 97, I saw orbs, and I saw basically big orbs flying around. So
Eric Davis, it was always fascinating to have you. That's a lot to chew on. Thanks so much. We'll have you back. I can't thank you enough for being here. Dr. Eric Davis.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Talk to you again sometime. And coming up, we switch gears. Adam Frank, professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester, talking about light of the stars and the fate of the Earth. Stick around. We'll be right back.